Thanks for joining us today, Michael Lorimer. We're talking about superannuation, and in the first segment you told us how the superannuation is intended to relieve the taxpayer's burden on looking after an ageing population in the future by getting people to invest a little bit in their savings now and creating an environment where that seems like a good idea to them. In the second segment, we said things have started to change and get more complicated. And last year and this year, we've had two budgets where it's been floated that superannuation could change completely and radically. Even if only for a small percent of people, we only hear the first part, that superannuation is not necessarily going to be like it is 40 years from now as it is today. And that's what we actually heard, is that there were some retrospective changes. Tell us more about those and clear up for me in particular, please, what was announced that didn't go ahead and that did go ahead? Because what I heard was, what my understanding or memory of it was that they floated some ideas and then backed off them. Was that right?
That's right. Well, there was one major measure that they abandoned after the Turnbull government was re-elected. And that was the probably most controversial measure that was announced in the May 16 budget. The proposal was original proposal was to put a lifetime cap on the amount of your private savings that you could contribute into a superannuation fund. That lifetime cap proposed to be $500,000. The kicker was that the $500,000 cap would have included any such private savings or contributions backdated to the 1st of July 2007.
That's crazy.
So you're telling me.
Because that means that what I pay today under certain tax rules could be taxed again with a law that's made 40 years from now.
That's in principle, that's what that announcement was all about. So that was the single most controversial measure, and we were fortunate enough to convince enough people to abandon it.
A conversation that shouldn't have had to happen in the first place.
Not at all. That measure itself nearly cost an election.
Yep, and so it should. That deserves a big smack.
Dreadful. Yeah. But the other retrospective measure, which did ultimately get implemented, applies to people who had already accumulated superannuation retirement savings above a limit of $1.6 million, and who had already started to draw down on that superannuation in the form of a private pension. So these are people who aren't on the age pension. It's all from their own private savings. It's all been built up over time under an existing framework. The rules prior to May 2016's announcement for those people was that following the Howard and Costello era and the Hawke-Keating era, that as long as they just drew down on those assets in the form of a pension, then any earnings that their superannuation account generated would be tax-free. That's the quid pro quo. So, and that was irrespective of your balance. So what the government has now introduced is that any amounts above $1.6 million in that retirement drawdown phase will no longer be tax exempt on their earnings. Rather, the earnings will become taxable again at 15%. That's retrospective as well, because you've got people who have entered into a bargain, entered into a contract.
That's right.
Under existing rules. They've only made those decisions because of the rules that were in place, which, quite frank with you, were sensible rules.
Yep.
The argument that the government made in introducing that measure was that it shouldn't be possible for wealthy Australians, to accumulate unlimited amounts in a tax-free superannuation environment. The reality is, and I'll go back to a comment I made in the previous segment, is that since Howard and Costello's major reforms in 2006-07, it hasn't been possible for a wealthy Australian to accumulate unlimited amounts of assets in super, because there have been annual caps on how much you can actually put in without getting a tax penalty. So the brakes were put on. The people, the really wealthy Australians who have accumulated, to their absolute credit, significant superannuation balances, have typically did so under the Hawke-Keating era, where you could put in unlimited amounts of private capital into the concessional tax environment. That changed 10 years ago.
It's already fixed.
Absolutely. The brakes were put on. It's only 10 years in. It hadn't been given long enough to run. So the reality, and that message got lost.
And it was offered with if you'll forgive my commentary, a socialist rationalisation. We're essentially jealous of people who have more money than us and think they shouldn't be entitled to it. In the meantime, that money has been taxed at a low rate, which is achieving its desired purpose of getting people to save for their retirement. And when those people are wealthy in retirement, they're benefiting the taxpayer again, not by tax paid, but by government budget saved.
Correct.
We don't have to earn the extra $1 billion because our budget is, the spending we need to look after retirees is reduced by $1 billion. We're in the same financial position because those people have been successful. And they, in their retirement, aren't scrimping and saving and staying at home and eating cat food. They're actually out there spending and stimulating the economy genuinely without requiring $900 gifts from Uncle Kev.
You've hit the nail on the head. Yeah, absolutely hit the nail on the head. And that's one of the biggest problems and frustrations that we've had and I've had with superannuation remaining part of our budgetary process. It should be stripped out of the budget. Yeah, there are budgetary implications, but what we'd never see in a budget is if the Treasury says that the superannuation tax concessions cost X billion per annum from a budget perspective, what we never see is what that cost to the budget translates to in terms of benefits in the future. Yep. It's not how they cost it. They only look at it, they base it, the way they cost superannuation concessions is they just say, well, if those concessions weren't in place, and we presume that those earnings or contributions would otherwise have been taxed at marginal rates or company rates, then we would have had this extra revenue. So the cost by having the concessions is the difference. Yeah. That's how they measure it. Yeah. So it's an artificial cost, particularly when you don't count what asset it achieves in the future, which is reduction on the public purse.
That's crazy. Let's talk about Singapore. And if you can think of a better jurisdiction, how is superannuation working overseas, Singapore if you like, that we could probably move towards if we're going to improve superannuation policy?
Look, I'm not an expert on the Singapore superannuation system. The problem with that conversation, I think, Dave, is that, and it's one that I've argued from an Australian perspective, is that you can't look at superannuation in a silo. Yeah. You have to look at it in the context of income tax and our welfare system. It's a package, right? Mm-hmm. And because they're all inextricably linked. Yeah, if you've got superannuation, it affects your social security entitlements. It affects how your overall your tax framework. Sure. But the problem is, and this is what happened last May when these reforms were introduced, it was just dealt with as a single package of measures without any conversation about, well, what effect is that going to have on welfare? What effect is that going to have on health and tax, etc.? It should have, because the superannuation reforms that came out last May were the only part of what was called the tax white paper process. They were the only part that were proceeded with. The tax white paper process, which was intended to be a whole of tax system review, including superannuation, was totally abandoned, and superannuation was just plucked out of it and introduced. And that was just all about $4 billion argued to be back to the budget. Okay.
And so that would have had, from the author of the white paper, or the authors, that would have had an unsatisfactory effect because the effects were designed to be cumulative and rely on each other.
Correct. Whereas what the government did was cherry pick the bit that helped the political sale of their budget. Yep. I mean, as I said, I'm not an expert on the Singaporean model. But
what about generally just improvements that you think could be made to further enhance? Is it pretty well good and we just need to leave it alone, or is there some fine tuning that would make it better?
We're in a position now where we genuinely need to leave things alone. I would have dearly loved this budget to have seen somebody with the courage to stand up in announcing the 2017 budget and say, look, we got it wrong. We got it wrong last year. We need to go back to the drawing board and see if in fact what we thought was broke was broken, or we should approach any future reforms with a lot more structure, consultation, etc. I would have dearly loved that.
Yep.
And so, if I had a magic wand, that would have been my wish. My single biggest concern with the measures that have now been introduced are around the maximum amount of assets that anybody can have in superannuation in that tax-free retirement phase. I have a concern about there being a cap there at all.
Yep. Because there's caps on the annual contributions.
There's caps on the annual contributions that they all, and then the other problem with that $1.6 million cap is that if you're not in retirement, if you have that level of total superannuation or more, you're not actually allowed to put any more private savings into your superannuation fund. You've just got to stop. I don't like that. So those two concepts I would like to see.
Let's keep talking about this in the next segment, where we'll also talk about the floated idea that superannuation would be a useful contributor to housing affordability problems.
Great.
Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a look at this great video next, and check out the website for even more interesting articles and episodes later.